Nantucket is a treasure trove of historic homes. There are actually over 800 pre-Civil War homes on this island. It really is a remarkable place. The whole island is part of the Nantucket Historic District. It was designated to the National Register of Historic Places in 1966. And it has been called the finest surviving example of an early New England seaport. You will see some exceptional antique homes that reflect the island spirit, and all these homes are still lived in today.
Here we are at Straight Wharf, which was built in 1723. And it's called Straight Wharf because it leads right from the Great Harbor straight up Main Street. And it reflects a time when Nantucket was the whaling capital of the world, and whaling was one of the first global industries in America. And it's that entry point when visitors arrive to the island by boat and just go right up Main Street.
Here we are at the Thomas Macy Warehouse. And when Nantucket was the whaling capital of the world, this was a very busy, bustling area right leading off a Straight Wharf that Miranda just told you about. So during the days of sail, there would have been many, many whale ships coming in and out of Nantucket, loading and unloading their wares, also trading vessels coming in. This was really a very active waterfront place. And Thomas Macy built this warehouse in 1846. And you can see he built it out of very sturdy brick. It has granite sills and lintels around the windows to frame the windows. And this would have housed ship supplies, oil casks that were coming in on whaling vessels. It was an active place. And now the Thomas Macy Warehouse is a property of the Nantucket Historical Association. And it is used as an entry gateway for Nantucket history, and it's also used as an exhibition space.
And it's funny you should say 1846, because there was also a great fire that began right in William Geary's hat shop a couple blocks up. Right. And it burned down a lot of the businesses in the commercial core of downtown Nantucket. Destroyed about, I think, 300 buildings, 33 acres. So after this great fire, the town had to rebuild in a sturdier way, let's say.
Right.
They widened Main Street, they built in brick, so just like this Thomas Macy Warehouse, to prevent any fire from destroying this town again.
Right. So you can see, it still stands today. If you had been standing here after the Great Fire, virtually everything that you can see was gone. This was such a destructive fire. But thankfully, this building, built in 1818, was not destroyed by the fire because it is made out of brick. So this is the Pacific Bank. And you may wonder, why in the world is this called the Pacific Bank? We are in the Atlantic Ocean. However, a lot of the whaling money was made in the Pacific Ocean. A lot of whale ships went way out to the middle of the Pacific to catch whales. So this was the repository of all that wealth that came in from whaling ships. And when the bank was built, the rear portion was used as housing for the cashier. For 24 years, William Mitchell was the chief cashier in this bank. So he raised his family, good Quaker family of 10 children, right in the rear of the bank. And one of his children was Maria Mitchell, who is one of our most famous citizens. There was an observatory built on the top of the bank, and there was a telescope up there. And in 1847, Maria Mitchell discovered a comet. And this was really a truly amazing discovery, the first comet discovered by a woman. So this brought her really national prominence, and she became a renowned astronomer.
So now we're going to go up into the residential part of Main Street. And as you said, this Pacific National Bank was built in brick, so it prevented that great fire from going up and destroying all the beautiful homes. So let's go take a walk.
Good.
So in 1873, Joseph Barney built this beautiful home for his mother, Eliza Starbuck Barney. And Eliza's husband was Nathaniel Barney, who was business partners with William Hadwin. We'll see his home up the way. But these two men own the candle factory, which now houses the Whaling Museum down on Broad Street. But Eliza, she was an extraordinary woman in herself. She was very active in social movements of the day. She was an abolitionist, a suffragette, involved in the temperance movement as well. And she was also a genealogist, and she recorded some of the first families, the Macys and the Starbucks and the Coffins. And it's most likely that she did this in the west part of her home in her library.
So let's take a look at the architecture of this house. This is an Italianate style house, and you can see the trim is very elaborate, beautiful fencing along here. And if you look up, you see beautiful belvedere and cornices, and it is just an elaborate structure. And when this house was built, it probably was 5 different colors, typical of a lot of the Victorian houses in that era. But we have no color record of this house, so it is now painted blue. And it is an H shape, and actually at the end of the whaling era, this house eventually fell into some disrepair. But in the 1960s, it was bought by a family named Beinecke, who did a beautiful restoration. And as you can see, it is beautifully maintained today.
So these 2 beautiful brick homes belonged to Henry and Charles Coffin, and they were 2 very successful whale oil merchants. And these are fine examples of 19th century federal style architecture. You'll notice some differences. So Charles' home, it's a little bit more restrained in ornamentation. It has the brownstone trim, the brownstone pilasters, rather than the Doric portico of his brother Henry, and it's topped with a roof walk instead of a belvedere. And these brothers were responsible for bringing the Dutch elms over that lined Main Street. And Henry really was the avid gardener who would travel to Europe and bring back these beautiful plants to really make the island vibrant.
Beautiful. And actually, this elm tree right here is one of the original elms. There have been newer elms planted along Main Street, but this is one of the originals. Now, as we continue walking up Main Street, please note the roof walks that Miranda mentioned. You will see other roof walks along the way. And these are actually called roof walks, not widow's walks, as many people call them. It's a nice story that women would go up on the roof and look out, wondering if they are going to become widows, looking for their husbands to return. But they were really built for fire prevention. So this provided a platform on the roof so that if there was a chimney fire, people could come out through the attic. They could go to whatever chimney had the fire going and dump sand down the chimney and put the fire out quickly. Please note the cobblestones on Main Street and some of the other side streets off of Main Street. These were laid in 1837, and before there were cobblestone streets paving, these were just sandy dirt roads, and it would be very frequent that heavily laden wagons get stuck in the sand. So the cobblestones were a great improvement. We are now standing in front of what are known as the 3 bricks. And these 3 houses were built in 1838 by Joseph Starbuck for each of his 3 sons. So it was William, Matthew, and George. And they're known as East Brick, Middle Brick, and West Brick. And Joseph Starbuck built these houses for his sons because he did not want them to go to sea. He knew what a dangerous business whaling could be, and so he wanted them to stay on the island and manage the family business. So they were very happy to occupy these 3 identical houses. He did not show any favoritism. Each son got exactly the same house. So this became sort of the Starbuck compound, not unlike the Coffin houses that we saw down the street. And by 1850, there were 17 first cousins living in these 3 houses. So this comprised the Starbuck neighborhood.
But Joseph Starbuck, he didn't really offer the same incentive to his daughters. He didn't build them these beautiful homes. He expected them to marry well, marry whale oil merchants, and that they did. Eliza, his daughter, we just stopped by the Blue Victorian at 73 Main, and his daughter Eunice married William Hadwin and lived right across the street. So these 2 magnificent Greek Revival homes were built by William Hadwin, who was the business partner of the aforementioned Nathaniel Barney, who we spoke about earlier, and they owned the candle factory, which now houses the Whaling Museum. You see, 94 Main, he built for his wife's niece, Mary Swain. It's even more ornate on the interior and the exterior. Has Corinthian columns, a 2nd floor ballroom with bent floor beams so that when guests would come to dance, it wouldn't disturb the plastered ceilings below. So William and his wife Eunice built the Hadwin House at 96 Main for their own personal home. And it is still quite grand. It's large ionic pillars, and it sits elevated so that Eunice and William could look over his brother-in-laws across the way. And this is really a fine example of the last architecture of that golden age of whaling. So William Hadwin was actually from Newport, Rhode Island, where he was a silversmith. So you can kind of see that in the aesthetic of the architecture. It's not as subdued as the Quaker homes around the neighborhood. And this is also open for touring because it's one of the NHA's properties. So now we're going to take a look at a home that was remodeled to keep up with the growing prosperity on Nantucket during the whaling industry. This home, like many of the homes on Upper Main Street, was transformed from a smaller scale earlier dwelling. And it was built in 1799 by Valentine Swain. But then in 1832, Thomas Macy remodeled the home with his wife Eunice. And Thomas Macy was a sixth-generation descendant of the first island settler, Thomas Macy, who came over in 1659. He really expanded the home, added 14 feet to the west end, different decorative styles of the epitome of Federal-style architecture, topped with a roof walk, a beautiful balustrade, an elegant doorway with an elliptical blind fan, ship's rail fence, and added a central traverse stairwell and made it into this 5-bay facade structure with 2 chimneys.
And by the way, it was the same Thomas Macy who built the Thomas Macy warehouse that we saw at the very beginning of our tour. Actually, over 100 years, Macy family occupied this house, descendants of Thomas and Eunice Macy. And then in 1947, a woman named Jacqueline Harris purchased this house. And it was always her intention to ultimately give this house to the Nantucket Historical Association, which she did do in 1987. But her mission was to really recreate this house and make it look like it would have looked when the Macys lived here. So she traveled all over the world. She collected beautiful antiques, silver, linens, wonderful artwork, and she just tried to make this house like it would have been. So a very lovely donation to the Nantucket Historical Association, and the house included everything that was originally in the house, down to every piece of silver, dolls in the attic, beautiful furniture. It's really a remarkable gift.
So we're going to look right across the street at 100 Main, which was built in 1829. And it was a duplex-style home for the 2 Starbuck sisters, Eunice and Eliza, and their husbands, William Hadwin and Nathaniel Barney, who were business partners. They had their candle factory right in the backyard of this home. And both these families were very involved in the anti-slavery movement and held abolitionist meetings here. And it was right next to a prominent Quaker meeting house.
This is 105 Main Street, and this is the oldest house on Main Street. It is the Christopher Starbuck house. And the original house was not on this lot. It was actually about 2 miles west of town in the area called Sherburne, which was where the very first settlement was. But Christopher's father gave him this land, and he moved the house to this spot. And when it first came here, it was probably about half the size it is now, with a parlor down below and a chamber up above. But as the family grew, they added on to the house. And they added on to the back with a shed roof. So it becomes the typical Nantucket salt box style home, with a 2-story front and then a very sharply sloping roof that goes down to a 1-story back. And another interesting thing about this house is that it sits right on Gardner Street, and you can see it sits at an angle to Main. Almost all the other houses on Main Street are flat onto Main Street, but because the corner is right across from Gardner, which is at a slant, the house sits at a slant also. And when it was restored, and it has been restored over the many years since it was built in the 17th century, it has been very authentically restored. So really a beautiful antique home that is still lived in today. And right across from us is the Civil War monument, and it commemorates the 73 men who were killed in the Civil War. And the base of the obelisk is actually a grindstone from the former Round Top Mill.
So here we are at 109 Main Street, which was home to Eliza and Robert McLeave. And Robert McLeave was a whaling captain, and on his world travels, he'd bring back oddities and souvenirs from exotic places to his wife Eliza. And she was an enterprising woman and opened up her own cabinet of curiosities on the second floor, and visitors would come to see her collection. But there's a travel writer from the day that said not only did visitors come to see her collection, but also listen to Eliza's lively presentation. And you'll notice these stairways that are turned out, oftentimes called welcoming arms or friendship stairways, that are quite practical. They're parallel to the street to allow for more room in the back of the home for those beautiful gardens.
Since we're so close by, let's just go up and off Main Street a little ways into one of my favorite NHA properties, Greater Light. And Greater Light is a really unusual property for Nantucket. This property was owned by two Quaker sisters from Philadelphia, Hannah and Gertrude Monahan. And during the 1920s and 1930s, Nantucket was becoming a rather thriving art colony. And these two sisters were very interested in anything that had to do with art. Gertrude was really an accomplished artist, and Hannah was very dramatic. She loved to perform, she loved to do poems and have musical evenings. So they really lived for art. So they rented some studio space downtown. And one day, after they'd finished their work of the day, they were coming up Main Street, and they saw a farmer leading a group of cows, a herd of cows. And they followed him right here, which was a barn, a livestock barn. And these two sisters had a vision. They just said, this is going to be our summer place. It's going to be the place where we're going to create art. And so they spent a lot of time working on their plans, converting the barn into a summer home. And these two sisters were avid collectors. They really loved to go to junkyards. They went to thrift sales. They collected things from all over. And you can see some of those things that they collected. If you look over here, which is where Hannah's bedroom was, you can see these gold stained glass bullseye windows. Those actually came from a tavern in Philadelphia that was being torn down, and they said, oh, we've got to have those. They collected wrought iron that you'll see around the house and all the interior. And actually all of that was given to the NHA when this house was deeded to the NHA. So they designed this lovely home, and they named it Greater Light from the Bible, from Genesis, which said God created two great lights, the greater light to light the day and the lesser light to light the night. And the house right next door, which was for their parents, is called Lesser Light. Thank you so much for joining us on this tour today. We hope you've learned a lot about Nantucket architecture, learned about our remarkable history, which is very unusual, and enjoyed the natural beauty of our island. And you also hopefully will learn how the island occupies a unique sense of place and harmony in American design.
Thank you so much for joining us today, and we hope you enjoyed this tour of historic Main Street on Nantucket. Come visit us down at the Whaling Museum.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Okay, off we go.
Here we go.